I want to bring in NBC's Ken Dilanian in Washington. Michael Schmidt is an investigative reporter for the New York Times who has the new reporting on Comey. He's also an MSNBC national security contributor. Ashley Parker is staff writer at The Atlantic and an MSNBC political analyst. Okay, Michael, we learned back in mid-May that Comey had been questioned by the Secret Service about a social media post that showed shells arranged in the numbers 8647, which Trump allies said was a threat to 86, the 47th president. Comey denies that, of course, but spoke to the Secret Service at least twice. Typically, right, that would have ended it. And what happened next?
So the night that Comey posted that and took it down, he was interviewed by the Secret Service, and he explained to them that he didn't know that the arrangement of the seashells had a violent connotation, that he had no intention of harming the president. Former Secret Service officials told us that at that point, given who Comey was and the fact that he had no violent history, that he was the former head of the FBI, that would have been the end of any sort of Secret Service investigation. But what happened was the following day, the Secret Service had Comey and his wife, Patrice, tailed by undercover law enforcement authorities that followed him as he drove home through North Carolina and Virginia to his Washington area home. At the same time that the authorities were doing that, they were tracking electronically his phone to understand exactly where he was. And these are two highly invasive tactics that former Secret Service officials told us are basically only used in the most extraordinary of circumstances when they believe there is an active threat to the President of the United States. On top of all of this, Trump himself was in the Middle East at the time.
So he wasn't even anywhere where he could have been gotten to by anyone who wanted to do him harm. But what is the Secret Service saying, Michael, about why they even took these steps in the first place?
Well, after our story came out, they put out a statement that essentially said that they have to take extraordinary, or they didn't use the word extraordinary, but they have to take measures that they believe they need to take because there are so many threats against the President of the United States. Indeed, there have been 2 assassination attempts on Donald Trump in the past year. We're coming up on the anniversary of one of them, of the Butler shooting. So, look, the Secret Service is in a highly scrutinized position where they have had severe, real threats against the President of the United States. But through our reporting and talking to different folks that understand how these types of situations are normally handled, this appears to have been an overreaction to what was not truly a threat to the President of the United States. And it raised questions about whether the Secret Service had done this, had taken these extraordinary measures to follow Comey, both physically and electronically, because he was someone that Trump has constantly said he wanted prosecuted. Trump has spoken at length publicly about that. He tried to have the Justice Department investigate him during his first term. Comey has been under criminal investigation multiple times. He has been the subject of a highly invasive and unusual IRS audit that came after Trump had told his then chief of staff that he wanted to get the IRS on Comey. So Comey has been under a massive amount of scrutiny, in part because of what Trump's critics say is Trump's efforts to have that happen.
So, Ken, let's talk about what NBC News has learned about both Comey and former CIA Director John Brennan being under criminal investigation. And we should say, again, they've been investigated before. They were investigated by Special Counsel John Durham. They've been investigated by the Senate. By the way, that report, signed among other people by then Senator Marco Rubio, they found nothing warranting charges. So what's the justification now?
So in the case of Jim Comey, Chris, we have no idea. In the case of John Brennan, we did learn that the current CIA director, John Ratcliffe, made a criminal referral to the Justice Department, and that came after he released an internal CIA review of the process behind the 2017 intelligence assessment, concluding that Russia tried to help Donald Trump defeat Hillary Clinton in the 2016 election. The review didn't dispute the assessment's conclusions, but it criticized how Brennan handled some aspects of it, and it appears the referral raised the question of whether Brennan lied to Congress when he discussed his views on the so-called Steele dossier in 2023, which, unlike most of his congressional testimony on this issue, would be within the statute of limitations. Now, I got to say, the CIA review does not support that allegation, and Brennan and his allies say this whole thing is a dangerous example of how parts of the intelligence community and the Justice Department have been politicized. Take a listen to John Brennan.
It is hard to believe that here we are 8.5 years afterward, we're still going over this ground that has been, I think, fairly well and exhaustively plowed. And I think this is, unfortunately, a very sad and tragic example of the continued politicization of the intelligence community, of the national security process. And quite frankly, I'm really shocked that, individuals who are willing to sacrifice their reputations, their credibility, their decency to continue to do Donald Trump's bidding on something that clearly is just politically based.
And Chris, I will tell you, as you alluded to in the intro, even within the Trump Justice Department, there are people who believe this story was leaked this week as a sort of bright, shiny object designed to distract attention from what is an avalanche of criticism being directed at Attorney General Pam Bondi and FBI Director Kash Patel over an entirely different issue, and that's their failure to deliver on MAGA conspiracy theories related to the Jeffrey Epstein investigation. Remember, they announced last week that there was no secret Epstein client list, no one would be charged, and no further documents would be released. This has caused a firestorm among Trump supporters. Bondi posted a video on X yesterday about her lawsuit against California over trans women in sports, and her post drew 10,000 comments, most of which seem to be criticizing her over the Epstein matter. So they are in some serious hot water over that. Chris.
Well, let me ask you about that, if I can, Ashley. As someone who has covered the administration so closely and covered Donald Trump for such a very long time, does this feel to you like something meant to distract from the problems they're having with the MAGA base, give them something that they can get behind?
So yes is the short answer, with a certain amount of caveats. It is incredibly helpful for Pam Bondi and Kash Patel, who are and Dan Bongino, who are in the middle of some very tough news cycles with their own base. And this is a base, again, who is still a little reluctant to take out their frustrations on Trump himself. So almost all of this ire is directed at these people one rung down. From their point of view, this is potentially a very effective distraction, because John Brennan and Jim Comey are sort of two well-known villains of the MAGA base, and you now have the Trump Justice Department taking potential action against them, although there is the very real possibility that this ends in the same way that the Epstein case does, which is sort of for the MAGA base, an unsatisfying dud. The only caveat I will say is that Trump he seems like a master of distraction, and he is. And people often ask, why would he replace one scandal with another or one controversy with another? And sometimes, not always, but especially from Trump himself, sometimes the result is distraction, but it's less the product of a grand strategy and four-dimensional chess and more the result of just sort of careening from one bullet point to the next.
Well, let me ask you about something that was just up in The Atlantic from your colleagues about the CIA note, as it is known, from Director John Ratcliffe, which publicly accuses Comey, Brennan, and former DNI James Clapper of manipulating intelligence in the Russia investigation 8 years ago. No new evidence, as the article points out, to back that up. Why do these things keep coming up over and over and over again in the face of absolutely no evidence that has been ever published or no charges that have been brought?
Well, again, these people are well-known, well-trod boogeymen for the president and his base. And Donald Trump came into office campaigning quite clearly on extracting revenge and retribution. And so in some cases, what you are seeing are his deputies doing his bidding or doing what they think he would like them to do. And one thing we've learned about Trump, too, is if you are a cabinet official or you are a top advisor and you are in a bit of hot water with him, for whatever reason, the most effective thing you can do, as we saw Pete Hegseth do in a news conference the other day, is, for instance, come out and attack the media or attack one of these people who he has railed against, really for the better part of a decade. That is an effective way to buy yourself a little more time.
Let me ask you in the minute we have left, Michael. I mean, people might say, okay, Comey and Brennan, they've looked at this again and again and again. They've come up with nothing, no big deal. But based on what we know about these types of investigation, what does it mean for the individuals, for their lives, for their families' lives, and frankly, for their bank accounts?
Well, I think the biggest thing is we don't know, and it's the specter of criminality. And Donald Trump seems to understand that better than most politicians, that if he can take the question of criminality and cast that shadow on someone, that it is something that weighs down on that person. It politically drives people against them, and it is a very, I think, for individuals, a fairly scary thing. Now, Brennan and Comey are a little different than sort of your average person in the fact that they have great means, they've led powerful institutions, they're effective operators on a national level. So in that sense, they've seen this movie before. But at the same time, they now find themselves having to deal with this again. And if you are a family member of theirs, or if you are them themselves, it just creates these questions. What is going to happen next? And Trump has learned over his time in office that the specter of criminality is something that's very powerful. Indeed, here we are talking about them as if they, are in deep trouble.